Hi, my name's Stephen McCauley. So today I'd like to speak to you about the mind model. Okay, would you like to know how your brain works? Most people say yes to that question. So, yeah, in order to do that, in order to understand how the brain works, we need to go right back to the very beginning, to the very beginning of a human being. So, we'll go back to the point of conception. And I want to ask you another question. What do you think is the first part of a human being that forms? Is it the heart, the lungs, the eyes? What's the first part that forms? Okay, if you said brain, well done you. That's a gold star. So this circle represents the brain, and specifically, this represents the unconscious mind because that's the first part of the brain that comes along. So we've got this unconscious intelligence in there, and what it does is it creates all the other parts. So it looks after bodily functions, and it creates things like the heart and the lungs and the kidneys, and it builds all those other things. So it's that unconscious intelligence that takes care of that. The other thing that it does is it looks after the immune system. So if you've ever went through a period where maybe you're not getting lots of sleep, burning the candle at both ends, etc., then you might find that you're susceptible to colds and flus. And that's because you're not getting enough deep restorative unconscious sleep, because when you're in that deep state, that's when the body really repairs. And actually, if someone gets really ill, then they can slip into coma, of course, and that's like the brain saying, okay, let's close everything down, go into that deep unconscious state where we can really get to work on repairing the body, anything that's damaged. So that's the unconscious mind. What's the next part that comes along? I'll give you a moment. Now, if you said subconscious mind, that's another gold star. So the subconscious mind comes along next. And that happens when you're still in the womb. You're still a baby in your mother's tummy. And it's usually around about 20 to 22 weeks when that begins to form. And what happens within the subconscious mind is quite a lot of things, but it all begins with the senses. So we start to develop the sense of smell, the sense of touch, auditory, visual, kinesthetic, olfactory, which is smell, and gustatory, which is taste, easy for me to say. So we've got all of these five senses that start to develop. And what happens is, even whilst we're in the womb, we can maybe hear something. So I used to sing to my children before they were born. I've got two girls, and I used to play guitar and sing, and they would react to that. So the sense would trigger a feeling. Now, I don't know if they liked the music or not, but they certainly moved around a lot when they heard it. Maybe they thought, oh no, I hope dad doesn't sing. Oh no, he's already singing. I don't know. But they were moving, so they could clearly hear me, right? So we get a sense, in this case, the auditory sense, which triggers a thought, which is that blue line, and that leads to a feeling or an emotion. Now, I've written it like that for a reason, because an emotion is just energy in motion. So wherever your attention goes, energy flows. So when we start to think about something, it starts to create an emotion. Now, let's look at this in the example of an adult, because the subconscious mind does this throughout your entire life. It's doing it right now. So we get this sensory data, sensory input. So let's say it's someone who smokes, for example, and they see someone smoking. So they get the visual sense, and that triggers a feeling or a thought, or an emotion. The thought's already triggered. That's what leads to the feeling or the emotion. And then when that happens, the feelings and the emotions start to trigger more imagined senses. So, we can get a kinesthetic response, like the feeling of, I feel like a cigarette. I know what it feels like to have a cigarette. So that triggers more senses. And then maybe you get a smell of cigar or cigarette smoke through the olfactory sense, the sense of smell, and that triggers more feelings and emotions. And then, maybe you think about the taste of a cigarette, the gustatory sense, and so on and so forth. So we've got all of these thoughts coming through the senses, emotions, feelings, thoughts, all these things create what we call a state, and that happens within the subconscious mind. So a state or a mood. So it could be in the mood for a cigarette. So the other thing that the subconscious mind does is, when a state is created like that, it finds a behavior. So it'll find a behavior, and obviously, in the case of a smoker, if they are in the state or in the mood for a cigarette, Okay, you're going to have a cigarette. That's the behavior. Now, if you repeat behaviors over time, they become habits, meaning we don't even have to think about it. It's habitual. It just happens. And what that is, it's part of what we call the protective factor of the subconscious mind. So the subconscious mind, it really just wants to keep you safe. It wants to do the best thing for you. And it doesn't always choose the best behavior, but it does have a good intention. So if you're in the mood for a cigarette, have a cigarette. Why? Because it feels good. And that's all the subconscious mind is interested in. Now, the other thing about this protective factor is it's quite lazy. So when it finds a behavior which becomes a habit and that works, it subjugates that state, it satisfies that state, then it's not going to change anytime soon. It just keeps it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's kind of the way it looks at it. So moving on, what happens next is this starts to feed into your beliefs and values. So you may believe yourself to, like smoking's a good thing to do. It's a nice thing to do. It makes me feel good. And your values might be that I am a smoker, and that feeds into the senses as well. Because when you think about it, if someone was a non-smoker and they started to experience the sense of cigarette smoke, then it would be a completely different cycle that would take place. Different habits, different protective factor and all that sort of thing. Well, not different, but a different solution, if you like, for a non-smoker. So you can see how beliefs and values affect that sensory data. Okay, so what's next after the subconscious mind? This one here, right? Can you guess? It's the conscious mind. And if you got that, I am so impressed. Well done, you. So when does this come along? Well, actually, this comes along after you're born. And I'll give you a moment to guess. And if you said between 5 and 7 years old, I am massively impressed. Because, yeah, it comes along when you're still quite young, but, you're a few years on the planet before this comes about. And actually, that's why you get the saying, give me the child until they're 7 years old, or give me the boy till they're 7 years old, and I'll give you the man. Because that's when the conscious mind forms. And up until that point, you've pretty much experienced all the emotions and feelings that you're ever going to feel before you're even 7 years old, generally. In fact, in Germany, children go to school when they're 7 years old. That's when they start school. So, which kind of makes sense because it's the conscious mind that goes to school. That's the part that we educate. And that's where the IQ is. Now, the IQ, we send it to nursery school or kindergarten, and then we send it to primary and secondary and college and university, postgrad, and so on and so forth. We put all of this effort into educating that part, which is great. Okay, that's absolutely fine. But I think generally speaking, we all want to be happy. And actually, happiness comes much more readily when we build the EQ, which is that subconscious mind. Now, EQ, emotional quotient or emotional intelligence is the subconscious mind. So about how you feel about things. So if you want to be a happy person, focus on the EQ, not so much the IQ. It's good to build your IQ as well. But the EQ can move up massively or down massively throughout your life, whereas the IQ is only about 4 points either way. So let's take an example of someone who's got a really high IQ, maybe a brain surgeon or an aeronautical engineer, something like that, but they've got a really low EQ, maybe a really low self-esteem, maybe really unsure of themselves or something like that, or maybe they have a lot of anxiety, and that person isn't going to be particularly happy in their life. But if you switch that round, let's say someone is, let's say a boxer, for example, really high EQ, not so necessary to have a high IQ as a boxer. You don't have to be book smart. Some boxers are, but it's not a requirement, is it? So we've got this high EQ because, we've got nutrition coaches, we've got fitness coaches, mindset coaches, we've got people looking after us, physios, we've got people feeding us the right sorts of food, and if you're successful, then you've probably got lots of money and people want to get a picture taken with you, and you've got your team around you, and it's just a happy existence because your confidence is high and all that sort of thing, but you don't have to be particularly intelligent. But you can see that if the EQ is high, even if the IQ is low, then you can still be a really happy individual. But the other way around, not so easy. Okay, so The other thing about the conscious mind is it's analytical. So if you get like a feeling, for example, you try and ascribe some meaning to that, don't you? Why do I feel like this? It's rational. It tries to work things out and put them into neat little categories. It tries to, make sense of things. And it's also critical. It's the part that's kind of, it sort of compares and contrasts, and it's quite critical. So let's look at the example of changing a habit. Okay. Now, before we do that, I want to just point out that the conscious mind makes up about 10% of your brain, and that's why Einstein says we only use 10% of our brain. So if we use that part to try and overcome a habit, because clearly if the conscious mind is 10%, then that part in the middle is the other 90%, and we try and change a habit, then we're going to use something called willpower. Now, the problem with willpower is it's really quite laborious trying to change a habit through willpower, because it's like an army of 10 competing against an army of 90, and it pushes back that old habit and the protective factor. It says, no, we're keeping this. This is good for the individual. Smoking, for example, want to give that up? No. Smoking's good. So anyone who's tried to give up smoking just through sheer willpower will tell you that they've probably failed many times. So yeah, that's the problem. But the good news is that army of 90, it's not the enemy. It's also your army, but you just have to learn how to command that army. So how do we do that? Well, we have to get into that subconscious mind. And the way to do that is to enter into a subconscious state or a trance state. Now, we can do that in a couple of different ways, but the main thing is we need to bypass the critical factor of the conscious mind. That allows us to get into the subconscious mind. And the way that we do that, well, there's various ways. One is shock. So let's say someone wants to give up smoking, they've tried through willpower, it's not working, and then they go and see the doctor. Doctor says, listen, if you don't give up smoking, you're in serious trouble. You may lose a leg, for example, something like that. That shocking news from an authority figure can be enough to just make that change at the subconscious level. So you're not thinking about the change, but you're actually feeling the change. It's like, I've got to do this now. There's no more playing around with this. It's a shock. And actually, shock is a form of hypnosis. So it's almost as though the shock hypnotizes us into making the change at the subconscious level. Now, the other way, and probably the much more pleasant and practical way to get into the subconscious mind, the subconscious state, is through relaxation. And there's a few ways to do that. There's things like meditation, prayer, reflection, and hypnosis, of course, as well, that allow us to deliberately enter into that subconscious state so that we can make these changes. Now, if you want to change a habit, my advice would be use hypnosis. Now, the definition of hypnosis is the bypass of the critical factor of the conscious mind and the suggestion and acceptance of change within the subconscious mind. So we can actually get into that subconscious state, make suggestions, and get the subconscious mind to agree and get on board with it at that subconscious feeling, emotional intelligence level. Now, when you do that, then the conscious mind just sort of catches up after the fact. So when you work through hypnosis to give up cigarettes, for example, you change the whole feeling, you change the state, you change your reaction to the sensory data that we looked at before, and then you just don't even want to smoke. And then the conscious mind, after the fact, notices this and thinks, well, that's really strange. I would normally be feeling like a cigarette around about this time of the day, and I'm not. So it's incredible. And there's all sorts of things that we can change. You may be habitually anxious. You may have a habit of getting angry. You may have a habit of not exercising, or maybe exercising too much. So there's all sorts of habits that we can change, but they're so much more easily changed at that subconscious level. So that's the brain. That's the mind model. Hope you found that informative, and I hope that it's opened your mind to the concept of hypnosis and how you could potentially use that to make some real change in your life.